It is my pleasure. Now, yet again, a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dmitry Bosnak to the Jordan Center. Dmitry has received his doctoral degree in Russian literature from the Linguistics University of Nizhny Novgorod. He has taught Russian and European literatures at the Linguistics University and at the Higher School of Economics in Russia. He has explored Russian literature from a philosophical perspective in his work, focusing on such topics as ressentiment, aesthetic experience, conceptualizations of will and love, phenomenological perspectives on transformative experience, and the elusive boundary between animality and humanity. His research has been strongly influenced by the phenomenological ideas of Mikhail Bakhtin. In 2011-12, Dmitry held a Fulbright visiting scholarship at Northwestern University, investigating the reception of Bakhtin in North America. And his current research focuses on the phenomenology of the event, and particularly on the comparative analysis of Heidegger and Bakhtin. This past winter, Dmitry had a research residence in Paris, examining Francophone reception of Heidegger's phenomenology, funded by a fellowship from the Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme. And this is the research that Dmitry will be speaking to us about, at least
not necessarily,
just
in part, just
okay,
in part.
at least in part. Okay, well, let's welcome Dmitry, and looking forward to you.
Thank you very much for hosting me here, and thanks a lot for those who came here in person and who joined us online. This presentation. Now, the works of Mikhail Bakhtin hardly need to be presented to a Slavic audience. And yet, despite the significance of his literary analysis, in my personal opinion, they still remain secondary to his philosophical explorations. I consider Bakhtin a phenomenologist philosopher in the first place. Perhaps this conviction is due to the circumstances of my own encounter with Bakhtin's work. I had a chance to read his works in the order they were written, not in the order they were published. Beginning from the earliest essays toward the philosophy of the deed, that's how I prefer to call it. It's act, but I prefer deed, and author and hero in aesthetic activity. Another piece of personal testimony. When reading Heidegger's Being and Time several years ago for the first time, I was stunned by the correspondences of almost verbatim nature with Bakhtin's text. This revelation is hardly new. For example, in the famous biography of Bakhtin, Michael Colquist and Katerina Clark note striking similarities of Bakhtin's concept of responsibility to Heidegger's Being and Time. But no substantial comparison has appeared since. Now, one may, however, question what the sense of a potentially infinite pursuit of similarities and differences may be between the philosophers who lived at about the same time, but did not influence each other. One may certainly point to the common context in the history of European philosophy, both profoundly influenced by Kant. Bakhtin and Heidegger polemicized against neo-Kantianism, although Rickard's theory of value seems to have left a deeper trace in the thought of early Bakhtin than in Heidegger. Both enthusiastic readers of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and certainly both exposed, albeit in different degree of intimacy, to phenomenology, not only Husserl, but also Max Scheler. Reconstructing the historical context of Bakhtin's and Heidegger's philosophies is a challenging but interesting task. However, such research, if it's ever to be written, should go the other way around. If we want to make sense of such comparisons, we should view them prospectively, namely from the perspective of the subsequent reception of Heidegger's work, particularly in the Francophone tradition, and still more specifically from the context of the new phenomenology in France, whose heyday was at the turn of this century. To be sure, what strikes here is the disparity between the philosophers in terms of the intensity of reception. Bakhtin is scarcely known in France as a philosopher. I mean, if you go to a bookstore in France, you'll find him somewhere in the aesthetic section. He's not among philosophers. So one of the aims of my project globally is to involve his analysis in the ongoing phenomenological research. Still, the question persists. What sort of problems and issues are we trying to solve as we intend to compare Bakhtin and Heidegger? The answer comes from some good pages besides from Francophone tradition. In the words of Emmanuel Levinas, it's the book called Unforeseen History. It's a quote: "I think that the new philosophical thrill brought out by Heidegger's philosophy consists in distinguishing being and a being, and transferring into being the relation, movement, and effectiveness that until then had resided in a being or entity, if you will. Existentialism," this is how Levinas called Heidegger's philosophy, existentialism is feeling and thinking of existence as an event. The corresponding and frequently occurring term from Bakhtin's early works, which has surprisingly been given relatively little of scholarly attention, the attention of commentators, is событие бытия, or the event of being. The event is at the same time one of the most heavily theorized notions in the 20th century, which is, I think, not incidental, and its interpretations are very different. And yet, Bakhtin and Heidegger's philosophies, in comparison, still have a potential to shed new light on this phenomenon. I do not aim to give an equivocal definition of the event in my today's talk, but the event always remains in the background of today's entire discussion. So now to the main part of it. It seems that the biggest contrast between Bakhtin and Heidegger is their treatment of others. The self-other relationship is in the center of Bakhtin's work. Heidegger has been criticized for the lack of attention to others in being and time. However, a closer look reveals that exiling the other is an intentional strategy in Heidegger's analytics of Dasein. Bakhtinian perspective helps to clarify why this happens and what Heidegger's theory omits. This theory's major point of departure is to refute the metaphysical concept of the autonomous subject that is objectively present, just like a thing, Heidegger writes. It's a quote. Even if one rejects a substantial soul, the thingness of consciousness, and the objectivity of the person, ontologically, one still posits something whose being retains the meaning of objective presence, whether explicitly or not. And he strives to overcome this state of affairs. Dasein is a term that denotes a subject that is not conceived in the matter of thingness or substantiality. As a result, Jean-Luc Marion can declare in 2002 that for almost half a century, all the phenomena that phenomenology has dealt with most boldly and profitably can definitely no longer be expressed and described in terms of either objectivity or beingness. So I think this is Heidegger's success. In 2002, we can see the results. Now, oh, it's not moving again. Can we do something about that?
So, unfortunately, that's. So, please,
Okay.
stop screen share and start it again. Okay, there we go. Seems to be
Oh,
moving.
it's moving.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to wake it up a little bit.
Okay, it's just a
Click around,
Okay, right,
yeah.
right. Thank you so much, Sasha.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the slide. That's the slide we need. Heidegger does not. No, sorry. No, Dasein does not exist in empty. It always, proximately and for the most part, exists in its world. The structure being in the world, in the Weltsein, plays a prominent role in Heidegger's analytics, and there is a principal analogy between it and Bakhtin's deed. For Dasein, to be in the world doesn't mean simply to be present there. It does something and determines itself primarily from these activities. In other words, Dasein is concerned about things, that is, it aims to realize certain objectives. Dasein finds itself, so this is the first quotation, Dasein finds itself proximately in what it does, uses, expects, avoids, in those things environmentally ready to hand, with which it is proximately concerned. And then Heidegger writes this itself in inverted commas, because Dasein does not really find itself here as objective reality. And we find a similar idea in Bakhtin. I live, it's Bakhtin now. I live, I come to be through my deeds. However, I neither express myself nor determine myself through my deeds. I actualize through them something that has validity with respect to objects and meaning, but I do not actualize myself as something determinate and determinable. For someone who performs a deed, the deed needs no hero. Bakhtin says that is a determinate person. It needs only goals and values that regulate it and steer its course. My own determinateness, I'm such and such as I am, is not for me part of the motivation of my deed. Here it is. To return to Heidegger, in everyday existence in which Dasein primarily is, it is neither something objectively present nor something primordially and immutably present. Dasein is rather determined, in this case, from the activity itself. This is actually how Heidegger understands the meaning of I in everyday situations. For example, in the statement, I bought some milk, the I does not pre-exist the action, but rather means something determined by the context, such as the concern to buy milk. Such handling of useful things determines my place, the there, that actually is the da in Dasein. Yeah, there, it's in there. Now, next slide. Success. So the same applies to others, who are also determined from what they do. They are encountered from out of the world in which concernfully circumspective Dasein eventually essentially dwells. So here's the thing. As a result, I primarily see other persons from the set of tasks that I share with them. And to pursue our examples from everyday life, I may say to my wife in the morning, I'll take care of the scrambled eggs and you cook the coffee. You and I, in these examples, are not substances. They rather indicate the roles of this shared activity. These words may actually be accompanied by gestures, like you take care of the coffee and I'm here by the stove, yes? That indicate the location of the implements involved in these activities. Being with each other thus expresses a shared concern about things in the world in which we all are. And this is the quotation, yes? Thing. Because such activities are shared, Heidegger emphasizes the similarity between me and others rather than the difference. So here's the quotation. By others, we do not mean everyone else but me, but those like against whom I am, yes, who I stands out. So there are rather those from whom, for the most part, one does not distinguish oneself. Those among whom one is too. So I'm just like others. So in everyday activities, we are interested in the object of our concerns in the first place, rather than in those who are concerned. Just as Bakhtin maintains, who performs a deed, the hero is not essential, but only the meaning the deed aims to realize. Consequently, Heidegger can say that both me as a self, as well as others, exist here in a concealed way. I might not even notice a person if the action runs smoothly as it should. I may give attention to a person for the first time if an interruption or a disturbance occurs. For example, I may get to know and even meet a supplier for the first time in person in case the delivery goes off the scale. Well, before that, probably I didn't even know this person if this person did. Heidegger pursues this idea of homogeneity of those who perform everyday activities to an extreme. Everyone is like everyone else. Just like when using public transportation, I'm in no way different from all the passengers. In fact, yes, subway experience in New York. In fact, if I keep saying I so often, especially in expressions such as I personally think, as for me, I prefer, this is, according to Heidegger, only to hide the absence of any difference between myself and others. In reality, most everyday activities can be done by me just as well as by anyone. I am irreplaceable only in relation to my death, not in relation to those things that I do. Heidegger terms such indifferentiation of self and others das Man, and maintains. Proximally, it is not I, in the sense of my own self that am, but rather the others whose way is that of they. Well, here is das Man. Yes, I prefer to use das Man because the singular form also plays an important role here. These others, moreover, are not definite others. On the contrary, any other can represent. It is this collective otherness to which one also belongs, determine all that is being said and done in everyday life. Das Man is no one and everyone else, and everyone at the same time. Design's everyday possibilities of being are for the others to dispose of as they please. And one belongs to the others, oneself, and enhances their power. The others, whom one thus designates in order to cover up the fact of their one's belonging to them, essentially oneself, are those who proximately and for the most part are there in everyday being with one another. While it is clear that Das Man is predicated on otherness, Heidegger views it as a mode of Dasein's existence, namely typical for being in the world, that he describes as unknown or inauthentic. He wants it to be clear, just as I am never an initially given substance, so others are not encountered as epistemologically pure subjects or objects present somewhere in the vicinity. Das Man, which is also not substantial in the sense of a solid entity that precedes all actions, is determined by concerns related to the world of equipment and useful things and which is shared with others. This mode of being, existence properly speaking, existence, is radically different from that of things and tools. Okay, I'm trying to find page number 6. Here. Bakhtin would have supported Heidegger's argument against the substance and subject of traditional metaphysics. This is best expressed in his lecture that we have only as the notes of his friend Lev Kumpiansky, but the idea permeates Bakhtin's authentic writing. I exist in being as in the event. The underlining is mine. I just want you to pay attention to these parts of the quotation. I participate from the unique point of happening. Religious impenetrability is not at all physical. My indelibility, the indestructibility of my unique place in being. By analogy with physical impenetrability, dogmatic metaphysics transforms it into a substantial one, whereas it is only eventual participation. This quotation says a lot, and we'll have to return to it. A few lines after that, we find a statement that may be called the crucial principle of Bakhtin's moral philosophy. Yes, between me and others, there is an abyss for a Christian. The division is total, me and others. This division is irreversible. So the question, how do these two quotes tally with each other? How do they correlate? Is Bakhtin expressing in the latter case, this quotation, in the latter case, a specifically Christian point of view, which is dependent on the idea of creation and ultimately production? God produces me as a sort of a thing. Is the idea specific for an ethical relationship, for which the difference between self and other is pivotal? Or is Bakhtin simply relapsing into metaphysical substantiality and construes I as a metaphysical subject? To address these questions, let us try to understand what is meant by the statement, I'm taking this from the quotation, the big quotation. My indelibility is eventual participation. For this, we will consider the following passage where Bakhtin refers to the event actually as an adjective, which sounds foreign to English, but it exists. It's been used in translations of some French authors. Eventual, I mean, yes. So we can't really use the word eventful. It has a different meaning. So eventual, yes. The adjective produced from the word event. I and the other find ourselves in a relationship of absolute mutual eventual contradiction. Whereas the other from within himself negates his own givenness. I, from my own unique place in the event of being, affirm and validate the givenness of his being and that he himself negates. And this very act of negation for me, no more than a moment in that givenness of his being. Yeah, sounds a bit complicated. Did I switch? Oh. Looks like we have this technical thing again. Because I thought I just switched to the next slide. Did you, Sasha, stop sharing the screen and then start it again just to make it work, or it
You
started?
can try that. I didn't have to do it last time. But I just clicked around.
How do you do it?
So I just clicked. I just clicked on the trackpad. So that seems to wake up the computer.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So this is the quotation. So Bakhtin typically uses the example of love to illustrate the mutual eventual contradiction of self and other. I love the other, but I don't love myself. But the other loves me, but does not love them like I would use themselves. This is the translation that was led mostly by the Russian gender of the word другой, which is masculine. And I leave it. By the way, a very short commentary on this translation. I'm not really happy about Lipunov's translations. For these reasons, I modified them to a certain extent. That's why I put the reference to Bakhtin's Russian collected works first. So this is CW means collected works. So I edited them heavily. But still, if this text appears in Art and Answerability, which is that collection where author and hero appears also, I give reference to Lipunov's translation. So that's his translation. I decided not to change it too much. Well, and if there's only one reference, this is my own translation. Okay, so I love the other, but I don't love myself. The other loves me, but doesn't love themselves. For Bakhtin, what we call loving oneself and taking care of oneself is actually different from love, just as a way of note. So we can say, I do not love myself in the same way I love someone else. I will refer to the eventual contradiction as heterovalence, a term that Bakhtin uses several times and reserves specifically for the difference between self and other. Well, for example, in this passage, I am the only one to come forth from myself while I come upon all others. That is the profound ontological eventual heterovalence. The Russian word is разноречие. Let me remind that Heidegger also repeatedly insists, Dasein is an entity which is in each case myself. I am myself. Its being is in each case mine. And he also adds, the world is always mine. By this, he evidently means something else than I of everyday situations, which is actually not authentic self, but das Man. Both Heidegger and Bakhtin proceed from the intuition that everything that happens to me and around me is accessible to me only from the first person perspective. But neither of them would accept solipsism as entirely convincing. So let us follow Bakhtin's argumentation. He says, I participate in the event from the unique point of happening. This means While I am in the world only in the first person, the heterovalence makes me experience that there is something beyond my power, experience the limit of my possibility. I'm not able to do for myself what I am able to do for the other. I might say vice versa, but I won't. This difference is irreversible. I can only be myself, never the other. Otherwise, there would be no impossibility. Just to compare, for Heidegger, design exists primarily as possibility, and its only limit is not the other, but death. That's the limit of possibility, the impossibility of my possibility. What is especially important here is the heterovalence, that the heterovalence is eventual. I participate in the event from my unique perspective. I can influence the event, but I have not created it. And I'm not able to control the possibilities that may come out of it. In other words, the event of my encounter with other precedes both of us, assigns to us our unique roles of participants. Only thanks to that, the event can be risky and open, as Bakhtin often describes it. It is not incidental that some phenomenologists have a similar view of the event. For example, the contemporary French philosopher Claude Romano also views event as essentially primordial. Contrary to Heidegger's concept of death, which is also mine, he puts forward the theory of birth. Birth is not simply a fact that once occurred to me. It is an event that since then and all through until my death continues to determine my possibilities. But birth is completely out of my control, something that totally precedes me and all my possibilities. I cannot have control. I mean, I can hear stories about my birth, yes, but I cannot control it. In fact, any event, according to Romano, during my lifetime precedes me. The event has always already happened, and I can deal only with its consequences, not its origins. For example, I can surely arrange a meeting with someone, but I cannot totally control the possibilities that this meeting as a fact may give rise to. I can only approach these possibilities after they have opened or closed, post factum, so to say. So far, we have this. I'm not primarily the subject that subsequently descends to the world and others occurring in their objective presence. For Heidegger, I'm determined initially and for the most part as a place of everyday activities, sharing anonymity with others. For Bakhtin, I am a participant of the unique beingness event whose place is significantly determined by heterovalence of self and other. But maybe Bakhtin's idea is too romantic. After all, he's writing about love. He has good reasons for it. Let me offer you a more adversarial example, a game of chess. Goodness this. So I borrowed this from the Heidegger scholar Günther Figal, who wrote nothing about Bakhtin. But this example also helps me reconnect the discussion with Heidegger's analytic of everydayness. Absorbed in the actual game, the chess players concentrate primarily on the moves they make. Otherwise, reflecting, for example, on the personality of their opponent would actually be a hindrance. Furthermore, the roles of the players as players are determined by the game itself, which actually brings them together. The game brings them together. The change in placement of the pieces on the chessboard is their common point of reference. Figal adds an important commentary. By making their move, each player in turn invites the opponent to make a move. That is, invites to devise one's own strategy with regard to the updated placement of the pieces. In this way, by making their respective moves and then giving the opponent a chance to make a counter move, the players open up, an important word for Heidegger, öffnen, open up for each other the opportunity for action. This observation seems to go a bit beyond Heidegger's theory, at least in its initial take, that communication in everyday life is predicated on a shared framework of concerns-oriented equipment. To apply Bakhtinian perspective, the otherwise neutral and abstract words victory and defeat assume mutually exclusive meanings for the players. For each of them, their victory necessarily means their own victory, which also implies that the defeat is the defeat of the opponent. Their worlds are not simply different, but directly contradictory. And this contradiction is not reversible for each of them, even though they may feel empathy or sympathy for their opponent, yes, but still it's not reversible. This irreversible contradiction, or heterovalence, is what allows the players to open up the opportunities for action for each other. The uniqueness of each player is not a pre-existing condition, but a situation created by the event of the game. And I would align here with Bakhtin and suggest that the condition of possibility for the entire event of the game is actually the eventual contradiction. It is not something like the chessboard with pieces, equipment, or useful thing, as Heidegger would. And even not the player's concerns, because just having these concerns somewhere, it doesn't actually show what happens. Doesn't actually. Of course, each of them has a concern to win, but how are these concerns related? This event seems to precede being together with things at hand that Heidegger is talking about. Well, please note that I say this provisionally as a point that probably needs to be proven for all situations. But how does Heidegger determine the relationship with others? As has been established, I and everyone relate to the world by means of circumspective dealings with the ready to hand within the world, with things, yes, that we encounter. Each of us primarily takes care of a certain business. In this regard, everyone is as much as design as I am. But how do these designs relate to each other? If not in the way of objective co-presence? Heidegger provides a special structure to account for this relationship, being with, or Mitsein, and he says that design is essentially being with. Just as design, this structure is also a possibility of being with others. That is why Heidegger maintains yes. Good. Being with is an existential characteristic of design, even when factically no other is present at hand or perceived. Interesting, right? Yet being alone among many does not mean that with regard to their being, they are merely present at hand, they're alongside us. Even in our being among them, they are there with us. Their design with is encountered in a mode in which they are indifferent and empty. Design then appears as a sort of a pre-existing matrix that can either be filled or remain empty. Despite Heidegger's explicit effort to provide the opposite, this mode of being is very much like that of a thing. Now consider the actual experiencing of loneliness is not just a deficient mode of being on a romantic date or hanging out with friends in the bar. Think about this situation. All these situations in reality have their own possibilities and richness of experience. Only some abstract theories, such as psychology, can view them as equivalent. The situation is not much aided even by Heidegger's distinction between handling things and being with others. The former is characterized by in order to und zu, using things for a certain end. The latter, then being with others, for the sake of willen, which appears to imply Kant's maxim that requiring that humanity be treated never merely as a means, but always as at the same time as an end. Caring of others may take a plethora of forms. In our example, with the chess players, it seems it manifests itself in that each player allows their opponent to make a move in response, and thus to helps the opponent to alter the entire course of the game. At the same time, Heidegger writes, in being with as the existential for the sake of others, they have already been disclosed in their Dasein. This actually means that all the possibilities of interaction with others are already initially envisaged in Mitsein, in being with. So any real encounter is but a realization of what was already possible from the start. Bakhtin would not buy that. That any event is a risk. Yeah, if it's like this, if the other has already been initially disclosed, there's no risk. Like it's complete guarantee. So Bakhtin's construal of the relationship of self and other is quite different. As we have seen, eventual heterovalence establishes mutual boundaries of our possibilities. I cannot do for myself what I can do for the other. But this limitation of the possible is also what makes possible, so to say, exchanging gifts or surpluses. Well, here is a description of sympathetic understanding. It is necessary to emphasize, Bakhtin writes, the absolutely gainful, excessive, productive, and enriching nature of sympathetic understanding. The word understanding, in its usual naively realistic interpretation, is always misleading. The point here is not the exact passive mirroring or duplication of another's experience within myself, and it's not possible. The point is a transposition of another's experience into an entirely new category of evaluation and forming. The gainful nature of sympathy means, for example, that I do not just duplicate or replicate another person's suffering in my heart, but I co-experience it from my own perspective, which actually enables me to console, to help, and simply feel sorry for that person. Moreover, sympathy is not just the positive counterpart of indifference, already provided within a certain structure of interaction. Rather, if you use eventual language, it is not guaranteed. What I mean by this? Like in a situation when you ask someone for a favor, the requested help may be granted or not, and you cannot control it. You just ask, and like people say yes or people say no, it's not granted. You do not exercise control over this. And finally, also, the most important point here is probably that this surplus that each of us takes, that I take over the other in this eventual relationship, is that it makes my deed actually necessary and not haphazard. So I believe it would be an oversimplification to say simply that Heidegger's theory is simply too abstract, while like what this analysis has shown is that the presentation of design is rather, well, rhapsodic in Kant's sense. It contains a mixture of different elements, concrete and abstract, and the analysis just moves between them without warning. The presentation of handling things is quite concrete, and it soars to abstraction when it comes to relationship with other people. Without announcement, Heidegger uses design at least in two meanings. Design A is not a generalization. It's not a generalization. It's a common structure that all individual designs share, and they actually replicate. This replication is possible only because design itself is nothing but a pure possibility. As actually Claude Romano says, design doesn't even need to be born. Heidegger himself says as much. Here's the quotation. The entity which is other has itself the same kind of being as design. In being with and towards others, there is thus a relationship of being from design to design. So they're all identical. Bakhtin, whose analysis consistently adheres to the phenomenology of consciousness that performs deeds, would have found such homogeneity, such transposition by analogy from design to design unacceptable. To remind, Bakhtin's point of view, the division is total, me and others, and this division is irreversible. To say something like another design, as Heidegger frequently does, another design, he says it, would mean as much as wooden iron for Bakhtin. Design must always be mine. It is clear that such theory cannot account for the difference between self and other. As a result, Heidegger's analysis focuses on the case of Das Man, in which heterovalence as the meaningful difference between self and other is nearly effaced. At best, it is explained away as only superficial, but this difference cannot be ontologically explained at all, even in the sense of Heidegger's ontology. And this difference can be conceived only as eventual. It is not to argue that Heidegger's analytics lacks attention to eventual elements. In fact, ahead of itself, care and timeliness are eventual structures, which explains coincidences with Bakhtin. However, the sense of Heidegger's phenomenological reduction from being to being makes him, from a being to being, makes him prioritize selfness, which alone can give access to being in his view. While being with, which is essentially for the sake of others, is a thing that needs to be overcome. The fact that design is essentially autoreferential, that is, in its very being, that being is an issue for itself, presupposes that its own most authentic existence is completely liberated of others. Well, it is a question, however, if the authentic mode is not actually a certain form of eventual relationship with the other. Such analysis, however, is outside the scope of my today's lecture, and it's the small part that remains. I will limit myself to discussing the inauthentic mode. So let us look at making coffee. I place my dripper on the top of the jar and set a paper filter inside it. Then I scoop freshly ground coffee into the filter. Next, I grab a kettle of hot water and start pouring in the center, moving in small circles. I anticipate all my actions from inside. Yeah, you can use it as at home. From inside, which allows me to control everything, especially the hot kettle. The world for me is distorted toward the objective of making coffee, while all unrelated things are filtered out. This circumspect handling of tools belongs to everyday activity, which Heidegger refers to the inauthentic mode of being. I am totally occupied by my actions, so Heidegger speaks here of being taken in by the world. Sometimes it is translated as fascinated by the world, but it's really, the German word is benommen. But benommen is like being anesthetized, like insensitivity. This is the word. So I'm benommen. It is noteworthy that later in the basic concepts of metaphysics, he attributes benommen sein to animals. They are completely controlled by their instincts, and therefore they're not real. But is the inauthenticity of my existence determined like from this activity itself? Which sort of amounts to a question, can I make coffee authentically? I believe we should not judge from a singular action, but look at a broader context. It is not incidental that the climax of Heidegger's discussion of inauthenticity is falling, which is primarily a phenomenon of human relations. Das Man means being taken in by everyday routine that dictates being like everyone else and accepting what everyone thinks. Coming to the authentic mode is like to stop being in the mode of Das Man and switch to the mode that he calls resolute running forth into death. And what if I make coffee while resolutely running forth into death? Well, I know you're tired, that's why I'm making fun of Heidegger. But there is an important point here. Heidegger seems to agree that the difference between authentic and inauthentic being is ultimately decided by a certain relationship to others, and not by him. After all, he admits that one can exist authentically even in everyday situations. These modes may even alternate. However, because Dasein is essentially autoreferential, he can say Dasein plunges out of itself, into the groundlessness and nothingness of inauthentic everydayness. But I do not really fall into myself. I don otherness. I become dressed as an other. When Dasein exists as Das Man, which is controlled by others, it probably does not do so completely unconsciously. That's an important point. Das Man conceals, of course, from one the fact of being guided by otherness, which is what makes it so powerful. But this does not mean that otherness is not somehow being taken into consideration. Otherwise, how could does man's major concern be that to be average, to be like others? Now let us look at a quotation from Bakhtin that describes something reminiscent in authentic experience in Heidegger. Well, I didn't put it on the slide. I just want you to hear, because sometimes it's difficult to see Bakhtin. You need to hear. It's very hard actually to quote him in short pieces. I'll skip something at the beginning. The author of Is That Possible Other by whom we are most likely to be possessed in lived life? The possible other who is with us when we look at ourselves in the mirror. When we dream of glory, when we make plans for our life, the possible other who has permeated our consciousness and who often guides our acts, our value judgments, and our vision of ourselves side by side with my own eye for myself. The other who possesses me does not come into conflict with my eye for myself. So as long as I do not sever myself in value from the world of others, I perceive myself within a collective, a family, a nation, civilized mankind. In this case, the valuative position of the other within me is authoritative for me. He can narrate the story of my life, and I shall be in full inner agreement with him. What is Bakhtin describing here? Well, I needed the word biography at the beginning. But you see, autobiography, they're pretty much the same things for Bakhtin. But biography is a form of self-objectification, isn't it? So I see myself from the eyes of the other. But it does remind, yes, das Man, an authentic existence. I encounter the other not as a real person, but as an imagined possible. In many more situations than I do even know. So Heidegger is correct that das Man conceals its power. Bakhtin's favorite example is mirror. Consider this note from the 1940s describing how one looks into the mirror. Falsehood and lies inevitably visible in the relationship with oneself. It is not I who look from within, with my own eyes of the world, but I look at myself through the eyes of the world, through somebody else's eyes. I am possessed by another. The naivety of merging oneself and another in the mirror image. I have no point of view on myself from outside. I have no approach to my internal image. From my eyes, foreign eyes look out. Well, we don't notice this. So, for example, when we're dressing for an occasion, the concern is to dress for an occasion. You have to put on some coat, maybe, or a jacket, but you're looking at yourself through the eyes of the other. Yes, even if you don't notice this. Well, I think the most heavily theorized example of this is male gaze. Yeah, definitely. It's taken into consideration, yes, somehow. So Heidegger only seems to think as much, but what he does not take into account is that the relationship with the other, not only with a real person, but with an imaginary possible other, and even such in the first place, is eventual. As such, this relationship is impossible to exclude. Bakhtin would not have agreed that the other is constitutive only of inauthentic existence. The authentic existence, the resolute running forth into death, is also a form of eventual relationship with the other. So you cannot, deal without the other. You cannot do without the other. But this is the theme of some future analysis and a future talk. I leave you in intrigue, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. I guess I will open my how should I do this? Well, okay, so we have two dimensions here.
Yes.
One is questions from the audience, and the other one is questions from the Zoom audience.
They are all
Yes. If well, let's first start maybe with the audience, and then if there are questions from the Zoom audience, please raise your hand or type in the chat, and I will call on you and unmute you. Questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dima, for a really great talk. I'm curious about the role of language, specifically around the issues that you were discussing, like self and other, because I'm curious, yeah, how language figures in your comparative analysis of Bakhtin and Heidegger, because for obviously, especially for a Slavist audience, Bakhtin is known mostly as a philosopher of language, and also Heidegger would also say that language is the home of being. So I'm curious if it has any resonance for this, like the self-other relationship that you were tracing.
It has.
Mhm.
Thank you very much for this question. And it's complicated because this I of everyday situations for Heidegger is basically I that exists primarily in the language.
Mhm.
And language is actually the form of falling. That provokes falling for it, right? And this sort of a fake difference that I try to enact with the other, according to Heidegger, in this everydayness, it actually happens in the language. It happens in the sphere of language. And for Bakhtin, he sort of echoes Heidegger here. He's talking about creative activity in author and hero, and he says that the author of a literary work mostly finds the language although already mythologized. And mythologized for Bakhtin means with significant presence of the other. So this perspective of the other is already present in the language. And accordingly, if we try sort of penetrate to this mode of existence that is I for myself, when I judge myself objectively without at the same time occupying somebody else's point of view, a conflict with language is inevitable.
Mhm.
So there is a certain point of correspondence here. Unfortunately, we do not really have so much information from Bakhtin. Well, I mean, Heidegger wrote 102, I think, yes, volumes, and we don't have so much text from Bakhtin to form here a complete theory. Because there is this theory of word in the Dostoevsky work. There is this novel as discourse and all these things, right? They could be integrated. That's an interesting question that should be researched. I believe there should be again, well, as I anticipate and as I expect, there should be again a form of some convergence between Heidegger and Bakhtin, and again there would be certain difference. It's interesting that in early Bakhtin, actually, language sort of not that important. He says that yes, well, what I call eventual like thinking, eventual being, for him it is participative or participant thinking, yes, which is участное мышление. And he believes that it is not always adequately expressed in the language. But again, where we're coming, this is like Bakhtin of the 20s and Heidegger of the 20s.
Right.
So the situation is really complicated, and I would agree with you here that it definitely does need require a special analysis, as just a number of other aspects, things here. Thank you.
May I just jump into the same question of language for just one moment? It makes me wonder also about the way in which one might be able to look at Bakhtin's and Heidegger's literary analyses in comparison as well, right? So with readings of Hölderlin or that Heidegger has, and of course one kind of obvious Bakhtinian point to make in this context might be to say that Bakhtin's preoccupation specifically with the novel as opposed to the lyric is something really quite prominent in relation precisely to this question of the self-other relationship in language, insofar as the novel presupposes a kind of the possibility of for Bakhtin at least, now presupposes the possibility of framing the other's voice in such a way that the other's voice breaks through the frame, right? That is the authentic usage of language, right? It's the other is treated as the self insofar as the other breaks through the frame that one has created for oneself. So it's a kind of staging of selfhood in language, which is, so I think it would be interesting to compare that to Heidegger, and then you could do Bakhtin from the 30s and 40s and Heidegger from the 30s and 40s as well.
It becomes more complicated because their theories, like, I think they start at a point where they have lots of coincidence of the phenomenology of the 20s, but then it becomes more complicated. I would agree, definitely, speaking about the theory of the novel, he definitely aligns toward otherness, because he says that in the novel, the word is not discourse of the word. I think we can use the word. The word does not really react to the object. It is primarily the word that belongs to somebody else. It is somebody else's word. And yes. But I would say that I'm not sure we can find any similarity of this kind. Heidegger probably will find something quite the opposite. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Jillian Porter. I work here. And I wanted to ask about Bakhtin specifically. So you mentioned that he has been, mostly thought of for his writings as a literary theorist in the West, and you are working to revive his philosophical legacy. And I was just thinking about how your approach and your work on his philosophical texts might change or alter the way some of us think about the writings on literature that we teach and use so often. So in particular, I was just really struck by your point that for Bakhtin, the division between self and other is total. And thinking about that in relation to the Dostoevsky book and just the whole idea of dialogism, and thinking about Bakhtin writing that Dostoevsky offered a kind of sociology of consciousness in which every person's word anticipates another's word, and so that seems like a model of consciousness in which the division between self and other is anything but total, right? It's completely not there. And then thinking about that last quotation that you brought in, where we see Bakhtin writing that the self is possessed by another. I mean, that sounds more like the Dostoevskian model. And so I just wonder how can we think about Bakhtin's writing about Dostoevsky's sociology of consciousness through the prism of what you're revealing as Bakhtin's phenomenology of consciousness, particularly around this question of, is the self fundamentally divided from the other or not?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would say there is a work in Russian by Tatiana Shitsova, who pursues like the aim to show that all Bakhtin's literary analysis are just sort of manifestations of his philosophy, which I don't really agree with, because I think he adapted to. Well, sometimes I really think that many of his work, like he's sort of interpreting his own ideas into those authors. So sometimes I honestly confess I have this feeling, but I think most of the time he was trying to read this into. He was not trying to read this into the authors he was analyzing, but he was trying to somehow adapt to them and try to understand what they were trying, like their point of view. So to answer your question, probably this initial, and well, I mean, sorry, I'm interrupting myself. So the problem is that Bakhtin is not homogeneous himself. For example, this theory of aesthetic finalization that we are struck by in Author and Hero, he sort of negates in the notes of the 40s. He says that any form of cognition of an aesthetic finalization is a sort of violence. This is especially like, I think this note is called the rhetoric in the measure of its falsity, something like that. Риторика в меру своей лживости. So, I mean, Bakhtin's view is not homogeneous, so sort of he takes different views. But what we can say is that this initial paradigm that Bakhtin establishes in philosophy of the deed and in Author and Hero helps him approach the well, I think Dostoevsky definitely in the first place, well, partly, but it comes later. Rabelais is later, but Dostoevsky definitely, and we should not forget that in Author and Hero, I think Sergei Bocharov wrote about it. Dostoevsky is viewed as an important exception to his aesthetic theory. There is a so-called неискупленный герой, an expiated hero of Dostoevsky, неискупленный герой. So I think he finds an interesting development of his initial point of this idea of aesthetic finalization in Dostoevsky. Maybe an important extension. So that's what I would say. So, but initially it functions as an exception to his theory, and unfortunately, we do not have, well, I mean, the text never existed. It stops at Author and Hero in Russian literature. And there, I mean, there's this title and there's no text. It's not because it's lost, it's because he didn't write it. So probably he would have accommodated his theory. Well, I mean, this is a very interesting question because at the end of Author and Hero, he says that this idealistic, sort of idyllic word of aesthetic finalization is not really possible in modernity. I do not tolerate being looked at from the outside. I need to experience everything from within, and this sort of distorts the artistic form. I think this may be a clue. It's just the final pages of the existing fragment of Author and Hero, and I think this gives a clue to this further development toward Dostoevsky book.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Just a glance at the Zoom audience. If anybody, I'm muted here, but I'm audible.
Yes,
too. Yeah,
yeah.
okay. I'm very disoriented. But yes, for those in Zoom, please do feel encouraged to participate. I'm not seeing anything yet. We'll go back to the audience, and I do have a number of questions myself. Thank you very much for this presentation. This was a kind of gift for me, because for many years I have been thinking similarly. Well, why hasn't anybody done in greater detail the Bakhtin Heidegger thing? But I have one quite concrete question about a particular point that Dmitry, that you made, which has to do with, and I'm remembering, I think, the chess match on the screen, and it has to do with the question of whether or not an event is understood as the realization of the possibilities that are already present, or the event is itself, in some sense, constitutive of the possibilities, or in general, right? Bakhtin's, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, my sense is that Bakhtin's theory of the event isn't really um, isn't really participating or is trying to kind of fight against this whole kind of transcendental conditions for the possibility paradigm. Right. So my question for Bakhtin is always, what does one do with pre-existing structure that's indeed there, in which Dasein is indeed already disclosed, right? So when you're playing chess, this is a great example, right? You have a situation in which there are very strict limitations on the set of actions that you are allowed to perform, or, you know, when we live in society, there are very strict limitations on the sort of actions that we are allowed to perform. What happens to this, right? So there's a sense in which I'm completely on your side in your Bakhtinian critique, if I understand, of Heidegger's very stumped conception of otherness, it seems. And yet there is this one place in which one does wonder that maybe Heidegger can, whether or not Heidegger may actually contribute something to Bakhtin, namely this kind of quasi-structuralist element in his thinking. Right, so the event takes place within a framework. The event is not primordial. The event is something that is harshly determined from the outside. Do you see this as a valid kind of retort, Heideggerian retort to Bakhtin, or is this misguided?
And so you mean that Bakhtin sort of is not, well, he sort of neglects these pre-existing structures when he's talking about
It seems to me, right? This conception of the event does that. With language, once he moves to language, it's a bit different, right? Because language is otherness already, right? And otherness is structuring in a certain sense, right? And there you have a sense in which, okay, you know, he's obviously not a structuralist, and he's very insistent later on in his writing that he's not a structuralist. But with language, you feel like you're a little bit on more solid ground when it comes to the relationship between the event and the frame for the event, right?
Thank
Or
you
not.
for the question that I didn't have a chance to include into my presentation, but
You addressed it.
I was hoping somebody might ask.
Okay.
But but you see, it's really a difficult question, although my answer, well, let me like try to give first a straightforward answer. Well, for Bakhtin, this is simply not a problem, because all the pre-existing structures, they are somehow involved into the event. And they are somehow like, the event is a sort of a crucible when all these things come into contact with each other. So it's not really like anything that is given already, something that pre-exists, also contributes to the event. But the event, the function of the event, and this is, I think, one of the most important things that I probably would have to underline in Bakhtin's theory, is that this givenness by the event is transformed into something that is difficult to translate into English. It is Zadanность, which is being assigned as a task. And I think this is really an important, crucial idea. It's also discussed by French phenomenologists. For example, Jean-Luc Marion that I mentioned today, he's also talking about this donation, which is Gegebenheit, givenness sort of things. Yes, so to answer, yes, if there are structures, they are given, but I cannot live by my own givenness. Once they are involved into the event, they must necessarily be transformed into this assignedness as a task, so to say. This is so. I mean, yes, you your genetics, you have your mother who definitely influenced, I believe, your perception of, this das Man, probably the first authoritative person to influence you is your mother, because when a child, Bakhtin likes this example, when a child says little hand, like little head, this is not the child's own language, this is the mother's language. Yeah, so you have lots of these pre-existing factors, but they are, this is that he wouldn't see it as a problem. If that is sort of, if that answers your question. We could talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. And I see also a hand from Boris Kasparov. Do I unmute?
I've asked him to unmute. So
Oh, okay.
should be able to unmute now.
That is.
Not.
There we go.
Yeah.
Huh?
Okay.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Very good. So I would like to ask a question related to the previous discussion about the apparent heterogeneity of Bakhtin's treatment of the self, of integrity of the self in his early philosophical works and in later works on Dostoevsky, and I would say in Slovo Romani as well. The dialogical. I was struck also with one point you raised early in your lecture about the religious nature of the impenetrability of the of person, of I, in contradistinction to the material Beharrlichkeit, impenetrability as claimed by traditional metaphysics, and why it is religious and specifically Christian, as Bakhtin says it. I would to continue this, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that in poetics of Dostoevsky and the discourse in the novel doesn't appear with Christian categories at all. And perhaps this is the answer to the question how Bakhtinian understanding of the integrity of the self changed with time. He didn't abandon religion, obviously, on the personal level, but stopped to apply it to his philosophical ideas, to his literary studies. And also, once again, why Christian, why religious is necessary for maintaining the integrity of I for the early Bakhtin.
Thank you very much for this question. This is a challenging question. Maybe my answer would be too dependent on Heidegger. But, well, definitely what Bakhtin is trying to say is that my existence is not substantial, it's not metaphysical, it's not Beharrlichkeit, as you said. But when we look at the specific mode of dealing with the other that I actually wanted to keep an intrigue today and did discuss, but your question sort of invites me to do that. This is the so-called samachot ispoved. And it's where actually God, primarily Christian God, appears as the other when I evaluate myself only from the point of view of myself in this position I for myself. The only thing I can do is just to condemn myself. I cannot enjoy my vibrant bodily presence, so to say, or even my rich soul and all these things, right? So sort of I negate all this and I turn myself into something like nothingness, which is actually reminiscent very much of Heidegger's Nichtigkeit, nichtig. But the more radical this tendency of self-negation becomes, the more I feel the need to talk to somebody else, to the other, and this other is God. And this, I mean, what is the specifically prominent position of God here in comparison, say, with some other person? Because, well, today I gave the example of a request. Yes, the request is not guaranteed; it is not granted. Yes, but for Bakhtin, I always, in a way, accede the other. The other is always in being for me, but I need someone who totally exceeds me, and this is God. This is how Christianity comes into play. And I would say that even though, well, it's a bit difficult now for me to give a clear answer because I haven't given much thought about it, that Heidegger's need for death, which is always a possibility of my impossibility, is sort of equivalent with this God of Bakhtin that is, yes, total other. Yes, and we definitely can see a similarity in Levinas, who has also been sort of criticized for this religious understanding of the other, because this is a total other. And I think that what is important, well, I mean, apart from those biographical circumstances of Bakhtin being a religious person and things like this, I think this is just an important element. God, Christian God, who is in the position of total otherness in relation to me, is an important element of Bakhtin's early theory of the deed. And at the same time, this is that God, because I'm like addressing, seeking like sort of forgiveness and exception, which like I cannot guarantee, which is not guaranteed. Yes, this is another important thing that I've not talked about today. It's guarantee. Yes, so with God, it's then die Götter leihen kein Pfand. Yes, the gods do not give any yes. So there's no promise, and this is how Christianity comes into play. Comes into play in Bakhtin's early philosophy of the deed.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else from either audience? I don't see anything in Zoom. One more question pose. Sorry, that was a different language grammar. Yeah. Yeah, so this is, I'm a little bit concerned that this question is not really somehow quite kosher. But it has to do with the relevant politics imagined potentially, right? Because I mean, the self-other relationship is traditionally philosophically a political relationship on some level, necessarily. A relationship having to do with sociality and forms of sociality and so on. And we have, of course, both figures who are Heidegger and Bakhtin, who have these very weighty, each one has these very weighty relationship with politics, simply by virtue of biography and looking out historically. So as you were working through these differences and similarities between those two figures, have you thought, even as a background or a kind of horizon, about the potential implicit political consequences for this or that conception of self-other relationship? Or is this indeed, as I said, taking it is the leap from phenomenology to politics too?
Well, philosophy does engage with politics, but honestly, I cannot like give a clear answer to this because it's still different spheres. I agree that that Bakhtin is also, even though it doesn't like seem so at first glance, he is involved in sort of political thing, and especially his theory of representation. When I'm sort of an imposter or a pretendant, I think it sort of contributes to political things. But I don't want to say that we have to differentiate between the works and biographical here. I'm not just saying this because this would be a complete differentiation would be a hypocrisy. But as for Heidegger, still, I wanted to say that attempts to like view Heidegger's philosophy, especially his works of the 20s, sort of retrospectively from those Nazi ideas that became popular in the 30s, is not really productive at all. And then I think the question is not for Heidegger, and the question is actually for us. Well, it looks like, I mean, those who criticize Heidegger very often try to make him acknowledge his involvement in the Nazi parties, which is actually a proven fact. He was sort of enthusiastic in a way member. And well, that's what Paul Celan also did. He wanted to get an answer, but he didn't. Now I think it's too late to try to get that answer
We
from
have that
Heidegger.
interview in Spiegel, right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's too late already. We cannot make Heidegger answer this. So the question is for us, are we ready to continue reading Heidegger? And I think there is, well, in spite of the fact of his involvement, there is something in his philosophy that that is still important, that it exceeds these political facts of his involvement with the Nazi party. So this is my stance. So I mean, he's interesting not only as, you know, a person who lived at a specific time and was involved in certain events, but also as a philosopher.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dmitry.
Thank you for